Good morning once again, everyone. I think let's get going. It's 11:02 a.m. For those of you who just joined us, thank you so much for joining us for our sixth webinar in the coronavirus series, where we focus on employers' ongoing responsibilities of being back in the workplace. For those of you who just joined, my name is Peter Links, and I lead our strategic risk consulting practice at Marsh Africa. I'll be your host, but also your moderator of the panel discussion for today's session. We hope that today's session is super interactive, and so we're going to rely on you to ask your questions via the Q&A little icon at the bottom of your screen. And so please do start asking questions as we move through the presenter's slide decks. But it's a great privilege to have you here today. Please note you've been muted. Your video has automatically been shut off, and that we are also recording today's session. Welcome to today's webinar. Next slide, please, Mpumi, where we talk about shaping the new normal. As you all know, we've really moved into a new world as we move through the various stages of this pandemic. And a new normal is slowly returning to both our personal lives as well as our professional environments. We believe, therefore, that this is a critical moment for organizations like yourself that seek to learn from and embed some of the lessons that we've learned during shutdown into your everyday operations going forward. As consumers and employers return to their previous ways of life, they're making conscious decisions every day about whether to embrace new habits on the one hand that were formed during lockdown conditions, or to return to previously well-established patterns, the old ways of working as we refer to them. Many organizations saw significant disruptions during this time, and every day that passes is really an opportunity to embed what we've learned, what we've assessed, to activate new practices and new ways of working. This really represents, to some extent, an opportunity to build back better, which is our focus here at Marsh & McLennan Companies today. So today we unpack some of the new practices, some of the new obligations, some of the opportunities, and some of the triggers to really help embed new practices, but also to help us all build back better as we really reimagine the future of the workplace. Next slide, please, Mpumi. So it's a complicated topic, and so in order to handle it sensibly and with the right kind of thinking, we've pulled together experts from across our 4 companies here at Marsh & McLennan Companies. First, we have Marsh representing the risk and insurance side of the business. We've got Oliver Wyman, which focuses on economic strategy and brand consulting, and we've got Mercer, which focuses on health, wealth, and career consulting. And so our panel is drawn from 3 of our four divisions today, or operating companies, in order to really put the best solutions in front of you, but to also help prompt some of your thinking, right? Again, it's an interactive session. The intention is that you get to ask your questions, and you have a panel of experts who can help you answer those. But in order to do that, we have given the speakers, because they are consultants and they are used to advising our clients. And so we've given them some time to really put together some key slides to not just set the scene for you, but to also help prompt some of your thinking and to prompt some of your questions. So let me introduce you to the panel. If we could move to the next slide, please, Mpumi. First of all, I'm joined by Heinz Play, who's a partner with Oliver Wyman. As mentioned, Oliver Wyman is a strategy consulting house, top tier, and we're very proud to have him be part of the Marsh & McLennan family here with us today. We're also joined by Bridie Paxton, who is the Marsh advisory leader for Marsh Africa. And Bridie has a team of 90 consultants that really help our clients every day think through risk and insurance and complexities, risk solutions, and to really, again, help you build appropriate solutions and mitigate risk. Thirdly, we're joined by Tisantha Naidu from our Mercer practice. Again, Mercer focuses on health, wealth, and career consulting. And I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves in a bit more detail so you get to be familiar with their areas of expertise. My name is Peter Links. I look after strategic risk consulting at Marsh, and I report directly to Bridie, helping our clients build and solve and fix, which is the main focus. The intention again today is to help you fix, to help you think through complexity, to help you think about potential solutions that you could build into your business, again, as we try and build back better. Next slide, please, Mpumi. So The focus of today is your questions. It is an interactive session. Again, we've limited the experts to 15 minutes in total. They each have 5 minutes just to set the scene for us, share some of the context, which will help form today's conversation. But I'm going to encourage you to please submit your questions via the Q&A panel below. I've been given instructions about how to do that. Let me just read here quickly. So you need to click on the Q&A icon in the corner of at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in the open area and please click submit to enable us to have the interactive discussion. And as we move into the panel discussion section, I will pull from your questions in order to make sure that you're getting the answers that we also desperately seek. Again, don't be shy to ask, because if you're asking a question, I'm sure there are 10 or 20 other people who are thinking about the same thing or haven't yet thought about that. And so it'll be useful for you to share some of the burning questions on your mind. So if we move to the next slide, we'll just give you an overview of what we'll be discussing with you very briefly. So again, Heinz Play will give you an overview of COVID, a global and a local context. In essence, how Oliver Wyman is viewing the current pandemic, and just give us context to the conversation. Friday will tackle the second bullet point, which is protecting workplaces and employees as we reopen. And then Tasantha will talk about the return to a new normal and what does this mean for the managers, the key cog in the machine as we bring our employees back to work responsibly. But again, that's 15 minutes. The other half an hour to 45 minutes is really around panel discussion and around your questions. So again, I'd like to encourage you to start asking questions as soon as the speakers start tackling their topics. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Heinz Play, partner with Oliver Wyman, and he will introduce himself in a bit more detail. Thank you, Heinz.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. My name is Heinz Pley. I am a partner with Oliver Wyman. My focus is on mining and the energy sector in Africa and in the Middle East. I'd like to share with you some of the latest global and also local health stats, our perspective on how the COVID pandemic may unfold further, and also the economic implications that all of this has. All of this is meant to provide a bit of context to considering the return to the workspace. Yeah. So if you give me the next slide, please. So this is a bit of a global perspective on where we are with COVID. These are data from end of last week, and obviously every day the numbers change a bit, but we have around 600,000 COVID-related deaths to date, and nearly 250,000 new cases every day at this point. With this, humanity is facing its greatest health calamity in over a century, since the Spanish flu that swept the world around the First World War. The WHO, World Health Organization, warned last Monday that the coronavirus pandemic is indeed raging out of control in many countries, and that the virus will continue spreading unimpeded unless governments and individuals take the steps needed to suppress its transmission. So looking at this and having lived through COVID for the last few months and having had all kinds of social, economic, financial implications, many people are asking, when is this drama ending? When is normality returning? And if you give me the next slide, I can share with you a little bit of a perspective on this. There's some good news and there's some maybe more sobering perspective on this topic. The good news is that clearly world leaders and the pharmaceutical industry are not sitting on their hands when it comes to looking for a cure and looking for a vaccine. There are 23 different COVID-19 candidate vaccines in clinical trials at various stages. Some of them are advancing nicely and are showing good immune response in early stages of clinical trials. And there is another 137 that are in preclinical evaluation. And so there is a good likelihood that within maybe the next half year, a first vaccine will be released, and maybe within 12 to 18 months, a large number of people around the world will have access to this vaccine. So, but that's not guaranteed. And the journey to getting there is going to be what you might call a corona coaster. It's going to be an up and down. You will have followed how this has gone on in different countries. In South Africa, we're still at the early and dramatic ramp up. When you look, for example, at the United States, you will see that New York had a massive spike a couple of months ago and was slowly coming back, and now we have a much bigger flare up in the southern and western United States, and we see the same in many other countries. Iran, which overcame its early pandemic, etc., is exploding again, and some European countries are going back into lockdown, such as Spain. So Corona is not over yet and won't be over for a while. We will very likely have swings and roundabouts of new localized or larger flare-ups of coronavirus before we will reach more stability. And more stability is probably only achievable once a vaccine has been widely rolled out. That's going to take some time. So when you consider not the health impact but the economic impact, it is clearly uncertain at this point because we don't know exactly how the coronavirus pandemic is going to roll out. But certainly governments are throwing money at the problem. The US Fed sees further large-scale asset purchases and additional fiscal support as vital for sustaining the recovery in the US. And you may have followed over the last 4 days, there's been a very acrimonious summit of EU leaders, which finally concluded last night with an additional 750 billion euro COVID relief fund. And this extra liquidity and negative rates in many countries are certainly in the near term inflating asset prices tremendously, but they also will be needed to sustain the economic recovery. So on the next slide, let's switch from the global perspective to looking at South Africa. South Africa is indeed is not having a good COVID. The COVID crisis is unfolding very rapidly. We have reached about 350,000 cases, and with that, South Africa has surpassed the UK and is now the 5th most infected country on earth. The only countries that are more affected are very large countries like the US, Brazil, and Russia, and India. So we also bemoan nearly 5,000 deaths to date in South Africa. So I must say, initially it seemed that the COVID outbreak was well contained when South Africa introduced one of the world's most stringent lockdowns with some unique measures like, prohibiting the use of alcohol, for example. However, as the country was really taking its first steps towards slowly opening up, the pandemic is clearly wreaking havoc. Infection rates are rising very rapidly and may only peak in September. South Africa's public healthcare system, which wasn't in great state before COVID, is clearly overwhelmed with the onslaught of COVID infections. And my fear is that the human toll will be immense in South Africa from the COVID crisis. When we reflect on the economy, again, the South African economy wasn't in great shape before COVID hit, and the impact of the pandemic is compounded by other challenges such as renewed load shedding and downgrading of South Africa's sovereign debt. The best case prediction for our GDP in South Africa for this year is a -3%, and that's the best case prediction. So that would really be another setback. When we reflect on what government can do about this, I have to say that South Africa's cash-strapped government really lacks the fiscal and monetary instruments to compensate for this massive drop in economic output in the same way that rich nations are. And the political infighting which we're experiencing to an extent is not helping that either. So we can't expect as much reasonably from the South African government as people can expect maybe in Europe or I wouldn't say the US. However, everywhere in the world, people are really struggling to get their minds around all the implications and trade-offs that they need to make in their personal lives, at business. Many of you are business leaders, managers, and employ people, etc. In some ways, I have to say, the pandemic brings out the best in humanity, and in some ways the worst. We've seen selfless dedication of healthcare workers and other essential workers but also a lot of irrational behavior, and in many instances, a failure of leadership. So, of senior leadership in countries, but business leaders also are really tasked here to take some pretty difficult choices. They have to balance across multiple needs and have to also anticipate the need to manage future waves of infection and suppression. So this, in our view, requires quite a flexible and adaptive planning process. Bridie and the center will, in the following, give you some more sort of practical advice on how people can prepare their workforce and their operations for a healthy return to the workplace. And with that, I'll hand over to Bridie.
Thanks, Hans. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Bridie Paxton, and I lead the Marsh Advisory Team for Africa. So in essence, what that means is we deal with anything to do with risk. As Peter had said, from strategic, being his team, all the way down to more operational risk. So very, very glad to be here this morning with all of you, as well as my colleagues that have joined me. So, wow, Hans, hearing that, we do have quite a lot of challenges that we're faced with, and I think even more so in the South African context. So really, us today being here is trying to guide you, trying to support you as far as we can. So I think we've all been in a position of really living through this crisis and have all, as organizations, responded in various ways. But I guess the next question is now what? And I think it's really about understanding where we are and how we proactively recover and rebound from all of what has taken place. And this is not easy. As Heinz pointed out, things are changing literally on a daily basis. We're in a period of such volatility, and the challenge is, how are we able to be agile in this time? And more so than ever before, we need to make decisions so quickly. And at the same time, we make a decision today, and tomorrow we may need to change that. So really, really difficult circumstances. And the impact that we see is at such different dimensions. So firstly, significant impact that we've seen from a financial perspective on organizations. The consideration that we need to take from a reputational risk perspective. Managing operations has become so different. And then the most important thing is really around our people. And how do we make sure that we're keeping our people safe? So if we move to the next slide, and really the purpose of today is understanding what do we need to do to protect our workplaces and employees as we start considering reopening. And as you will all know, the workplace that we're moving into is going to look completely different. And this ranges from physical distancing measures that we need to put in place, the workstations being totally redesigned, and all of these things that we need to consider are additional controls that we're putting in place. And with additional controls, there's a cost component as well. So are we really looking at cost versus benefit in terms of going back? The other thing that's really important is with the controls, we're redefining our policies, our procedures, and that's one thing. But the more important thing is the implementation thereof. And this is really around, are we creating the appropriate awareness, understanding on why we're doing this, and training for our employees. Because if this isn't done, the implementation fails. It's also really critical that senior leaders are held accountable, but are leading by example. Really making sure that we're setting very clear expectations for our employees, and outlining the importance of why we're doing things the way we're doing it. Lastly, we've said things are changing so quickly, and we are going to make mistakes. We're living this day to day, undoubtedly so. There will be mistakes. But what we do need to do is, once that is identified and we know what the root cause is quickly be able to understand how we need to change things going forward. So having specific metrics in place and making sure that we're continuously improving from where we started. So moving on to the next slide, what we've done from a Marsh perspective is really prepared a very practical guide on how we return people to the workplace safely. This has been prepared really to guide all decision makers across all industries, so from C-suite to risk health professionals, really to support you during this time when there is so much confusion and so many things going on. So the guide is available on the Marsh website, and it is at no cost. We've prepared this taking into account the knowledge that we have in safety management systems, in industrial hygiene, ergonomics, as well as workplace productivity. So as you can see on the screen, it covers a wide variety of topics, but ultimately it helps guide a framework. And this is around sort of identifying, firstly, should we be going back to the workplace? Secondly, how do we develop then those policies and procedures and controls around that? And thirdly, how do we then implement this? So in each of the different chapters that are set out in the guide, what is taken into account is firstly, our colleague health and safety is paramount. Secondly, we need to make sure that we're respecting our employees' privacy. And this, I think, quite important as we see the privacy laws, specifically in South Africa, now coming into play. Thirdly, we need to consider, right, the big word. So have we actually looked at all options where employees could potentially be productive as well as effective through other virtual arrangements? The next one is regulatory requirements, and we see this changing quite rapidly now in this space. So always making sure that this provides a general guideline, but we're going back to the regulatory requirements that are required of us. And then lastly, taking all of this into account is ensuring we have a flexibility in balancing employer as well as business needs at all times. So with that, I'd like to now hand over to Santha, who can take us into more around what does this actually mean for managers at this point.
Thanks, Bridie. Hi, everyone. My name is Tasantha Naidu. I'm a senior associate at Mercer, and I'm within the career consulting space. I specialize in employee experience as well as organization transformation. So if we look at returning to the new normal and what exactly this means for managers, my colleagues have already mentioned the impact on the economy, the impact it may have had on your organization. How do we return to safely, and how do we return with some form of stability? Now, if we look at the last aspect within this being, how do we actually help employees return to energy? So what does this mean for managers? If we move to the next slide, we focus on 3 key areas. Now, if we look at the 3 circles, the first one being support your workforce mentally, physically, and financially. So the mental return to the workplace matters and employees want to be heard. So what does this mean? Essentially, organizations need to relook at the way in which they manage the employee value proposition and the employee experience. So healthcare delivery, for example, will be transformed by the necessary rise in digital and telemedicine options. Employees will be facing financial hardship, but it's up to the employer to actually understand what this means in terms of job security concerns. Now, if we look at reconfirming the organization's purpose and value, employees need to feel a sense of belonging. So companies that are ahead of the curve essentially are taking the opportunity to reconfirm their value proposition and align benefits to values. And lastly, if we look at designing and energizing employee experience, as an organization, do you understand which experiences will unleash the most energy and impact your employees positively? So if we move to the next slide, and we look at briefly just some of the key themes that came out of our survey, which we've run across the globe with most of our clients, 3 key themes have been noted. So the first one is employees have a great respect in which most of their organizations responded to the outbreak. The situation, however, is starting to have an impact on the employees' confidence, and employees are feeling uncertain about the long-term job security. So we can look at some of the mechanisms that managers and employees can use to actually connect with the employees, to actually understand how they're feeling and help them transition through this process. But if we think about it holistically, and Heinz mentioned this earlier, the next 12 to 18 months will be a roller coaster as economies and organizations digest the full emotional and economic consequences of the pandemic. Now, employees will require energy and confidence to survive and be able to thrive, whether it's in the workplace or still at home. We need to actually understand what that blended work culture means for employees. So with that said, as a sustainable organization, please pay attention to your employees. We do understand that leaders and managers are also employees, but you also have the added responsibility to help your teams transition through this period. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Tasantha. And as we head into more of the panel discussion now, again, just a reminder to pop your questions into the Q&A panel. And really, we want to field as many of your questions as possible. But let me get us going by just reflecting on what Heinz had to say earlier. So Heinz, as you know, we've seen, as you mentioned, we've seen the spike in South Africa across winter, 5th highest number of cases now. Globally, do you believe that some of the new measures that government is taking around level 3 status, such as the curfew from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m., the suspension of the sale of alcohol, ventilation within public transport, interestingly, do you think that this will bring down the projected numbers?
I think it will help, Peter. I must say that the slight opening of the economy that has taken place has led to a very sort of significant increase in cases. Some of the measures that have been taken are really there to directly reduce the infection risk. I mean, it is true that well-ventilated spaces, being outdoors, etc., certainly reduces the chance to get the necessary viral load, because it's not about getting a single viral particle, it's really about getting a certain amount. You can get that certain amount from breathing in if somebody sneezes in your face, yes, but otherwise it may take longer exposure to an infected person, etc. And the more our spaces are confined in an office, in a taxi, in a plane, etc., the more we are at risk to basically breathe in more virus, etc. I think the alcohol is a somewhat unique South African facet of the lockdown, etc. And I'm sure it's painful for many, but at the same time, I have to say, I don't think it's primarily there to reduce the infection risk, even though I would imagine that it will help social distancing, but it also helps to reduce the pressure on a very sort of overloaded public health system, right? Because we saw over the last months or so, as restrictions were loosened, that there was a rampant increase in accidents, and I think more than half of those car accidents, etc., trauma cases, etc., had to do with drunk driving. I mean, it's just unfortunately a social ill in South Africa, and I think the measures that the government is taking, while draconian, are necessary in order to slow down the explosive growth of the virus.
Thanks, Heinz. Yeah, great points around our risky behavior, right? Potentially, and how it's difficult to control behavior. So you put in place the controls to be able to mitigate some of that. Bridie, from your perspective, what are some of the challenges employees will have to balance when we return to work, if we return to work?
Thanks, Peter. So I think exactly to your last point, if you return, I think that's the first step, right, is really considering all other alternatives based obviously on the dynamics within your particular organization. If there is nothing else, then, we should. And when we do, there's really a lot of considerations that need to be taken into account. You will see in the guideline that we have released, it really goes into quite a lot of detail on the specific areas, but maybe just, to name a few, if you're looking at going back after a long suspended time and you've got specific, equipment or machinery that's been standing for a while, how safe is that? Were we able to keep up with the maintenance of that during the time that we were away? We need to obviously consider your, going back to your basics around protocols for physical distancing, rearranging the workplaces. Also then, hazardous controls that are out there, once again, very particular to certain industries, but, how are we managing that? We're also in a position, if we look at hygiene, we're bringing in, other chemicals around sanitation to help with sanitation in the workplace. So how are we actually controlling those substances? Also, I think around incidences. So once this happens, how do we then respond? Going back to, trying to also help us around the potential reputational risk that posed to organizations. Ergonomics, extremely important, not only being back at the physical workplace, but from a home environment. And then also the safety culture that we now need to start implementing, which is really important, and how do we drive and embed that within organizations.
Thank you, Bridie. A complex answer, really talking about the employer's responsibilities, depending on the nature of the industry, I think is a point that both Heinz and you've now made, but then also the employee's well-being and ergonomics, and so let me ask that question now, because I know everyone on the call is wanting to ask it. Does the employer now have a responsibility to cover the cost of my Wi-Fi? I'm a millennial, I'm allowed to ask.
So yes, like I said, a very important topic, and this is really going to be something that each and every employee or employer is going to have to look at very carefully. So it's really going to be around revising complete policies and procedures, dealing where we have employees working from home, and at the same time still making sure that that is in a safe and productive and effective environment as they would have been when working in the workplace. So simple things like, do you have an appropriate chair? Do you have an environment that you can actually work without disruption? Employers will have to guide employees around this. And it will ultimately also then, I would guess, be up to the manager to almost approve, to say, okay, we're comfortable with the space that you've created or not. When it comes to all of the other costs, one of them being Wi-Fi, as you've mentioned, Also doing an assessment of what that cost is versus the benefit. So is it a requirement? How do you separate the two when it comes to personal and business? And having very, very clear protocols around this. And then lastly, very importantly, is what is the requirement from a regulatory perspective where the onus is on the employer.
Okay. Thanks, Brady. So, and any of the other panel members, please feel free to jump in, but really around cost-benefit analysis, right? Around policies and procedures. So, I mean, if we do that, it needs to be carefully guided by policy, procedure, by protocol, and also your responsibility in terms of the regulatory environment, the OSH Act in particular. Heinz, I heard you make an interesting point about, why would business do this? What is the benefit? What's in it for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to consider that COVID is not only a sort of momentary issue, etc. It will be with us for a while, and it may even allow us to build back better, right? So this is, I think, in some ways, if there is a silver lining perhaps on this dreadful disease and all the economic impact, is that it may accelerate the transformation of the workplace, right? Many people are finding out that actually their organizations are working quite effectively from home. Many of the people don't actually need to be at home all the time, etc. Or in our businesses, we're serving clients, etc. Normally we would be at our clients 4 or 5 days a week. We're finding out that our clients are actually accepting of us being on a video screen, etc. And I must say, I feel quite productive working from home in many instances. There's rarely a moment really when I said, oh, I wish I would be in the office now. So it is an opportunity to rethink the whole workflow, how to reduce complexity, how to keep people focused on what really matters, to also build a bond of trust between employers and employees, right? Because many people are surprised, and maybe to some extent we have our people come to the office to make sure they actually work, etc. But we find that in some ways people working from home can be much more productive when they come back. So my hope is that in many ways, when we eventually are beyond this health crisis, that we will not go back to where we were before, but that we will go back to a workplace that in many ways ensures more sustainability in terms of better lifestyle for employees, greater productivity for employers, maybe a step forward in terms of combating climate change.
Okay. So important point. So what's in it? So taking a longer term view, right? So actually building back better, so not just responding to the immediate need by balancing all of those things that Brady spoke about, but actually to say, well, there might be some instances where it's actually people are more productive. So it makes business sense to actually allow more flexible working arrangements. But that comes with more complexity, and I'm going to turn to Santha here to talk about, so that really increases, I think, the burden on managers in some ways. And to Santha, what are some of the things that you think that managers, actions that managers can take to help employees transition to this new normal?
Thanks, Peter. I think that's a really good question, because the manner in which we deliver has fundamentally changed as a result of the pandemic. And what that means is that organizational goals would have changed. But the key question is, how transparent have employers been with employees? So when we talk about transparency, again, are you taking employees along the journey, and do they understand what's expected from them as individuals within their roles now that we're in a completely different space? So some of the challenges would be things like employees being too scared to return to the workplace, and are employers accommodating to that fact, or is it forced? So if we look at things like strategic workforce planning, previously we spoke about it in a completely different mindset in terms of skills required, when it would be required. However, if we look at it now, workforce planning, strategic workforce planning is, do you need all your employees at your office every single day? Or have they adapted to this new normal where you have skeleton staff essentially at the office, whereas the rest of your workforce at home? So in terms of communication, there's no perfect answer. You have to understand what works for your organization. We have been seeing a lot of organizations conducting surveys, having one-on-ones, having Zoom calls with their smaller teams. But the fundamental point is when your employees speak, we need to listen. Because previously, when we conduct engagement surveys, it's a tick box exercise. Employees give you feedback, and then you wait until next year in hope that those percentages would increase. However, if we look now, employees are telling you this is what they want, this is what they're looking for as part of their experience. What are you as an organization and as leadership actually doing to accommodate those needs? And then Peter, sorry, I just saw a question
Yes.
on the side from Tim, asking what should the employee experience look like now? Tim, to answer your question, there is no stock standard answer. It has to be designed around your workforce. It's specific to your workforce. And that's the reason why, if we look at the employee value proposition holistically, it entails the purpose. So do employees feel connected to your organization? They look at their career. Is there a clear career path for all of your employees? Well-being. How well is your organization taking care of your employees, especially during this period? And then the last sector being the compensation portion. So typically we would only look at compensation, and organizations always come to Mercer and say, but please give us some salary survey information. The employee experience is much broader than that. So yeah, we need to take all of those factors into consideration.
Thanks,
Maybe
Tasantha.
I
Yeah.
can just jump in here and, taking a practical example. And I think sometimes just going back to the little things. So personally, one of the things that I've really missed being in the workplace as such is when you had those quick 2-minute chats, just bumping into someone, as you were going to the lift or walking to a meeting room. And I think only now realizing how important they were. And with that gone, one of the things that I've implemented with my team is literally try on a daily basis, just give someone a call, as if it was I'm bumping into you, just having a quick minute chat. How are you? What's happening? And sometimes those conversations actually brought up the most important topics, right? So really just thinking, I guess, outside of the box of those things that we're now missing, and how do we bring it back as practically as possible.
That's a great...
Sorry, and if I can just add to Bridie's point, because it's actually very important that we discuss this. We talk about the introduction of humanocracy. So previously we spoke a lot about bureaucracy and hierarchy and having to go through various levels within the organization. But if we look at humanocracy, we're all humans at the end of the day, and we need a human touch and the human element. Everyone is in your organization because they have a contribution to make, so we need to listen.
Cool. Thanks, Bradley and Santa. And this goes to, and I again encourage you to ask your questions via the Q&A icon in the bottom. And Yushan Naidu has a question, and it's related to the topic. To Santa, what would be the preferred method to engage with staff regarding their concerns? How do we elicit, that feedback? What are some of the ways, and what is the ideal or the preferred way?
So what we've seen in the vast majority of the organizations that we have been interacting with is they are running sort of pulse surveys on a more regular basis. So it's sort of a touch point. So you reach the broader organization, but then you can actually measure progress on a weekly or monthly basis. You don't want to survey fatigue your organization at the same point. But considering different technologies. So you have different generations within your workforce, and understanding how they connect with your organization. That would be my advice.
Okay, so again, understanding the employee experience and how are different generations connected, because they all feel purpose in a different way. And so using all the platforms, a great point. There's a question from an anonymous attendee, so I'm going to just read it out. Given all the preventative measures in place and the costs they impose, both financially as well as the emotional toll on employees, if an infection does occur during the back to work process, how do employers manage and contain the costs and the emotional strain employees face? And I think this is a question for you, Bridie. So given all the preventative measures, what happens if, there's another breakout, essentially, an infection on site?
So, yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one, right? It's really around how do we plan after we've already, looked at all those preventative measures that we could put in place. But I think it is important within that planning to really identify specific employee post-infection return to work policy, where we do have an incident. I think it is important where we have the incident, like I said before, we're going to be in a position where we do make mistakes, right? So that we're able to quickly and return back to, okay, well, what was the issue and how do we rectify it? But also for me is, as we open up and we're considering all these different things and we're confident that we've put, all the controls that we need to in place, is at that same point always go back to thinking, well, should an incident occur, what then? And what decision do I then need to make quickly? And then going also back to what is the potential cost on that? How do I then communicate to my employees in the best way possible, taking into account the privacy requirements, etc. So I think it's almost, planning in the case that it should happen again, and not being almost so confident that nothing will go wrong because we've actually done everything we can. Being that in the place of we're in this stage of recovering, but we need to quickly rebound back to how do we respond.
So maybe building on what Bridie said, right? One thing is really to anticipate that this could happen and to organize your work such that you can contain the fallout from a single employee being tested positive, right? And you can do this by basically ensuring that the people that have to go back to the workplace don't all sort of mingle with each other, etc. That you contain in smaller groups of people that really need to work together closely. The number of people that could get easily infected by an infected employee, right? That's the first step. That's part of preparing and planning to think about who will actually have to get close to whom at work. But then once you have an outbreak, I think the first and foremost issue is besides taking care of the infected employee, of course, is to really understand who did this employee get in contact with, in terms of both his colleagues, but also potential clients, business associates, people that he would have touched or been close to over the preceding days. Because one of the real challenges with this virus is that it is actually infectious before it shows symptoms. Very different to some other, for example, Ebola, much more deadly, but it's not infectious before you show symptoms, right? So this virus is kind of stealthy in that regard. So I think the countries that have done particularly well in containing the virus are the ones that have invested a lot in testing and tracing and really know who everybody has touched with. If you don't do that, the only option is full-scale lockdown of whole cities, whole countries, or basically closing the whole office again. So the smarter you are about preparing and also responding to a single case of COVID, the more you can contain the impact on your business continuity.
And if I can just add to that, I think it's important for organizations to be adaptive in that sense. So if there is an infection, our organization's equipped to go back into isolation, because a large majority of organizations prior to us going into lockdown were not equipped for employees to work from home. So we always need to be cognizant of that.
Great point. And I know of an example of a client where highlighting the importance of logging who's coming to office, what are their whereabouts in that office, so that you can notify people quickly, and then to the points that have been raised earlier, you can communicate honestly with transparency, I think is the key word there, and make decisions quickly, as Bridie pointed out. I'm mindful that there are 9 minutes left. I want to encourage you to please ask more questions. There's also a poll that we'd like to take, but I'm gonna ask one more question from Lily, or Lele, sorry for the pronunciation. How do you balance equity? Those who can work and those who cannot work from home, if possible. I'll let anyone jump in for that. I'm gonna pick on Samantha.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question and a difficult question because there is no answer to that. It's dependent again on the organization. Yes, there will always be a situation where not all employees can afford to work from home given infrastructure and IT requirements and would prefer to work from the office. However, the organization may not always allow for it. So again, and I know I sound like a broken record, so I apologize, but listen to your workforce, because if they are able to be physically present at the office with all of the safety measures and mechanisms in place, then we should communicate with those employees or that portion of the workforce that actually want to be at the office, to allow them to be back at the office, but making sure we're adhering to all of the required standards that Bridie has outlined.
Great point. And Bridie, I mean, thinking about an example about a survey that I've seen, where we're actually giving people the option, and actually surveying your employee base to actually say, well, what is your preferred working style during this time? Because there are some people who need to be at office, as an example. Do you want to add some color?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is really difficult, especially where you have, and personally experienced this within our business, where, you have employees that cannot work from home. But at the same time, you cannot force employees, and you need to make sure that they are first comfortable in their own right, and also take into account that there are some vulnerable groups out there as well that we need to consider. So I think it is, also on the onus of the employee to make sure that they are comfortable going out. And then extremely important where we are doing that is that we're providing them with the necessary equipment or the environment from the workplace that is truly safe as far as we can possibly do.
Thanks, Bridie. Heinz, would you like to add, or can I take
the
next
question?
question?
Interesting question on the Q&A, and it was about what good is it to talk to your employees if you cannot meet their needs? This was a topic on remuneration. I think this could be a broader topic, right? Because as an employee, you may feel certain pressures and challenges, etc., whether they be financial or have to do with family care or transportation or what have you, etc. I mean, I think the question of the employer's obligation, comes in a number of different ways. One is, as you said, OSHA regulations, etc., statutory requirements of what you have to provide according to contracts. The second one is, I think, a consideration of also economic impact, etc. Does it make sense or not to enable people to work from home, etc.? Is their contribution valuable enough to invest the extra money, etc.? The third one is more on the emotional dimension, where we sort of talk about this is also an opportunity to, as I said, to almost build a stronger bond of trust with employees if you have the sense that you can trust your employees and the employees trust the employer, right, that they do the right thing. And when it comes to, for example, say financial hardship, the specific question, one thought would be that maybe as a company we have to cut salary for our people across the board, or for certain categories of people, because there's maybe reduced working hours or financial strain on the business, etc. Some people may be harder hit than others, right? Maybe there are ways to extend some loans to certain employees, etc., that helps them through a particular hardship, etc., without necessarily giving them a higher salary. So I'm not saying that's an easy solution, but I'm just saying, to some extent it's an opportunity to also reflect on the unique needs that employees have and our unique needs of these employees, to sort of find a happy medium and as we said, always kind of engage, communicate, and use this as a way to improve the level of trust.
Yeah, and sorry if I can just add briefly, you'll never be able as an organization to avoid the remuneration question. And I've never in my career seen an engagement survey where an organization was actually happy with their remuneration. That will be a miracle. But I think to Hein's point, just be transparent because that's what employees are asking for. Be transparent. It may not lead into a salary increase, but you've had the conversation, and there needs to be an understanding between the employer and the employee in terms of the way the remuneration is structured and why it is that way.
So, and as we try to wrap up, I mean, if I could give you a practical example, I recently had questions from my own team around training budgets haven't been cut, and you know that we have very clear and dedicated training plans within the organization, and I with one person I had to kind of had a very honest and transparent conversation about. There are other ways of obtaining training, online training. We have access to amazing material, but when we're balancing up training costs versus salary costs, of course we want to keep the money for salary costs rather than for training where there are other alternatives that not in every case. And as soon as I framed it in that conversation, the person was like, I'll pay for my own training, don't worry. But it was kind of a case of just having that honest conversation about where the business priorities are at this point in time, as difficult as that may be. So I'm told by our conveners, our marketing department, that I'm not going to have time to do the polling, and I think we've answered most of the questions. But I would like to go around and ask the panel to just maybe wrap up by thinking about a few things. So the topic was the employer's ongoing responsibilities as we return to work. But Heinz, from your perspective, how do we build back better? What are the key things that we can use as this see COVID, and as sad as it is, as an opportunity to really build back better? What are the 2 or 3 things you think we haven't spoken about in some detail?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've spoken about a number of these topics, but I would say if you reflect beyond the immediate health risks, etc., I think it is really a potential trigger for us to think about how we can reduce complexity and increase automation in our work processes. I think some people have found that actually, unable to go back to the office, unable to follow all the normal procedures, some organizations get more productive from doing this, etc. So the question is there maybe a lot of clutter in our businesses, processes, structures, etc., that really are not helping our fundamental purpose? And there's both organizational considerations, but also technical considerations, right? Which processes can be automated? There is, really a step change in the use of big data, artificial intelligence, etc. A lot of jobs that in the past could have been done by only by humans can now be done by machines, etc. So, and yeah, I mean, this has implications also on already high unemployment and what have you, etc. But these are all considerations I think that employers need to have just about the workflow itself. And I mentioned before already, I think the considerations around employees' lifestyle. I mean, in many professions, people work extremely long hours, travel extensively, etc. Certainly, management consulting is one of those, but it's maybe not the worst and not the only, for sure, right? So, if we can find ways to make certain jobs more sustainable, right, then we will have more people that will actually want to build a career in these industries when they, for example, reach the stage when they want to, have a family, etc. So there's, I think, this dimension that we can consider where working from home may actually, less travel in general may just be a welcome sort of relief, etc. And then we have the whole question about the climate change, etc. So reduced travel, etc. can make a very significant contribution towards climate change, which is another topic that shouldn't fall off the table as we're concerned about our health and our wallet.
Great point. So by way of practical example, then I'll hand over to Bridie. I have a team member who is saving 3 hours a day commuting. And this person has become so productive. I actually don't know how they are getting to all the, I had a call and I was like, are you okay? And we kind of came to the conclusion that because they have more time in the day now, they're able to just do so much more and they're less exhausted, right? And in terms of your point around the impact on the economy, that's 3 hours worth of fuel not being burnt and carbon dioxide not being spewed into the air, So yeah, so there certainly are opportunities around around reducing complexity. Bridie, any comments from your side? Final
Yeah,
comments?
so I think we need to be in a position where we really embrace this change, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think through the whole hour we didn't really talk about any of the positives that have come out of this, and they have been, right? So really to embrace a change, to continue learning from each other, because we're all in unknown territory, right? And then lastly is really, again, finding that flexibility in balancing between the employee and the business needs, which ultimately should be to the benefit for all of us.
Yeah, thank you, Buddy. A nice summation. And then to Santha, any concluding thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think just echoing the sentiments of Heinz and Bridie, people are your competitive advantage. So in terms of your employee experience, ensure it's empathetic, enriching, embracing, and efficient. Thanks.
Please say that again. That was good.
Sorry, no, I was just saying in terms of the employee experience, we need to, as organizations, make sure it's empathetic, enriching, embracing, and efficient for the employee.
Empathetic, embracing, empathetic. Thank you so much, Tasantha. I think we're going to end the conversation here, but not without saying that it is still a very complex topic. And there are one or two questions we haven't gotten time to answer adequately, but do reach out to the experts. However you've come to this webinar, whether that's through your client executive or whether that is through the websites, please do reach out to us. I would also encourage you to download the practical guide. As Bridie said, it is not at cost. It really should be. It's that good, I must admit. So filled with practical solutions to really be able to help you not navigate this complicated topic as best as possible. But do reach out to the experts. I think we also have an email address. That's great. There we go. So marketingafrica@marsh.com, and the marketing team have helped us put this together across Oliver Wyman, Mercer, and Marsh, the three sister companies within Marsh and McLennan, and reach out to whoever you deal with most. But you can reach out to marketingafrica@marsh.com to really answer specific questions, because it is topical. And as risk, insurance, strategy, people, wealth, and career consultants, we're here to serve you. We really are here to help you think through these complex topics in more detail, and to help position some solutions that make sense for your business. Because of course it's not a cookie cutter solution for all. So I think with that note, I don't think I'm supposed to say anything else, because I also have strict instructions from the marketing team. So I'm going to end it with a big thank you to Heinz Play, partnered Oliver Wyman for his input, to Bridie Paxton, who's the Marsh Advisory Lead for Africa, and to Tasantha Naidu, who's the Senior Associate in Mercer, where they look after health, wealth, and career consulting. And it's been a privilege spending an hour with you. I think next time it needs to be an hour and a half, to be honest. But please have a good day and reach out to us at marketingafrica@marsh.com for more information. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.